Yeah. Great. Okay, great. So transcription has started. We are recording. Great. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Oregon Public Records Advisory Council Legislative Subcommittee meeting on July 15th, 2022. We're continuing our process today of trying to set a shared understanding of what the problems we're trying to solve are as we look forward to proposing legislation to address the costs of public records in Oregon. So the first thing we have to do is, since we do have a quorum, is to take a look at our agenda and approve that. So everybody has that in front of us. I'll just run through it briefly for those people who can't see on screen. Our plan is to approve the agenda, to continue our discussion that we started last time, looking through the public records cost concerns document, discussing our concerns, rewording things, coming to shared understanding. If we get through that today, we would move on to discussing and revising the public record advocate proposal for a draft law, the straw person document that Todd put together that was shared on our website. We will save time for public comment at key steps along the way, and then we'll wrap up the meeting by determining what our next steps will be, with a mind to the logistics and the calendar. So can I hear from someone if they have a motion to approve the agenda, or if there's any changes that they want to make? I think Steve actually has his hand up. So Steve, did you want to make any amendments first, or?
I was just going to suggest that I do think that the remaining items on our list for pain points, there's like 8 or 10 of them, and I think it'll take a good chunk of time. Maybe could we move the straw person discussion to the very end, on the off chance that we have time to jump in that. I have a feeling if we were able to get to the end of the list of concerns and have some consensus on that today, I think that would be a huge accomplishment unto itself, and then we could save the next step for the next meeting, and also make sure that we get that time for public comment in right after the discussion of pain points.
Okay, so you're moving that we move the public comment period right under to the discussion of pain points as far as we get to it in today, and move the item number 3 down to the end to make clear that we'll get to it if we get to it, but it may be the next meeting. Am I understanding you correctly? Yeah, okay. Yes. Okay, does anybody have any comments on that? Or does somebody want to move to accept the revised agenda?
So moved.
Okay, and does anybody want to second that?
Second.
I got a second with the fingers. Okay, great. So all in favor of accepting the revised agenda, please say aye.
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 Great. Anyone opposed? Okay, hearing nobody, we will move on. So the public records cost concerns, that document is also on our website as we left it last time. I sent a note to everybody. I'm just going to pull that up. I sent a note to everybody to just ask you to take the time, which I'm sure most of you were doing already anyway, to read through the rest of it, and just to put a little thought into it ahead of time, so we know we get the best mileage out of our time here. Let's see, last time I think I shared my screen, right? And we could all sort of see how notes were going. Yeah.
Hey, Emily, I'd like to make a request, and
yeah.
If I may, and please, everybody, take this with a grain of salt. I'd like to request, and because we don't have bylaws that have been adopted or frankly formulated for the Public Records Advisory Council, I'd like to make a request, and it's sort of in keeping with the legislature's procedures in video meetings. And that is, unless a member of the public is actually speaking, that members of the public certainly are more than welcome to participate. They just need to turn their cameras off, okay? I think that that's really helpful for the PRAC and for others in who may not be familiar with the council to ensure that they know who the members of the PRAC are. I know that it's not a big deal, but I just find it to be more helpful if we're looking at the members of the PRAC, and then when it becomes available for public comment, that at that time the public can turn their cameras on. It just makes things a little bit more smooth. Thank you.
Sure, that is fine with me. Does anybody have any objections to that? Okay, and are all of us who are members of the PRAC, does everybody have their camera on? Is there anybody who's here who doesn't have their camera on? No. Okay, because that's also an important piece of that. Great. Mark, thank you for bringing that up. So back to the agenda. Let me get the document up, and I can share screen to continue the conversation. I'm going to just remind you from the next. We had finished step 5, number 5 in our last meeting, and the number 6 concern is listed as it takes an excessive amount of time and resources to review documents, emails in particular, for non-releasable information. So that's where we can start the discussion. I'm going to take a minute to get that document and share it, just so everyone can know where we're going to start. Please give me a minute. Sorry for the delay.
By the way, if it wasn't mentioned, welcome back, Tyler.
Thank you. Happy to be here. You know, I did ponder public records at the occasional 2 a.m. feeding, so
Good.
I'm caught up.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just looking for my. Hang on, you guys. I apologize. I came like straight from a work meeting and didn't have time to pull this up, and now I can't remember if it's a Google document or if it's a Word document. So hang on. I appreciate your patience. Here we go. Yeah, that's the right one. Yeah, okay. All right. I am now in a position to be able to share this on my screen. And I do that by the share tray, right, Todd?
Yes.
All right. So is this visible, this document? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right, so where we are right now is on item number 6. It takes an excessive amount of time and resources to review documents, emails in particular, for non-releasable information. And what we were thinking through was, what we did in the last session was talk about who this affects, and clarifying this this concern, so people speaking up on how they see this concern. And if solution ideas do come up, we're trying not to spend a lot of time on those, but I'll take notes in that column as well. So this item, is there anybody who wants to speak to it up front? I am having trouble seeing everybody. Oh, there you guys are. Okay. So, but yeah, so would anybody like to comment on this particular concern? Tyler.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I just think it's worth noting. I think this is always true. I mean, my initial thought is yes, this is a concern, but it's also worth noting that the problem is becoming worse because we are doing more and more remote work, and emails seem to be flying at an even greater speed. So I know that even certainly for my members, but even at the association level, there has just been a proliferation of stuff that is only continuing, it seems, because we keep adding these new mediums and new ways of contacting each other. So in the hope of sort of, adopting the build a better mousetrap transparency by design, I think we need to think proactively, not just for the tools that we use today, but the tools that we're going to be using.
So this word email might not be enough.
Yeah, I think there's, thinking of tools that people are using like Slack or Google Chat or anything else that is just creating more and more searchable records.
Okay. Our middle column is thanks for that, and that thinking in the future best law. That's a really great approach. But so who are the people that this really affects, this particular concern? Tyler, you're talking about the members of the government, county government. So is it fair to say this is government agencies who are really affected, government, or like the workers who are actually doing the work?
Yeah, if that was for me, Emily, I'd say yes to both. I mean, certainly the bodies at large, but then the individual employees as well. It's it takes more and more time, and thus more and more time away from whatever their other duties may be.
I would say this
And
also.
whoever.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry to jump ahead of Todd, but I think it affects anybody who, whoever's carrying the cost, whether it's the government through a fee waiver or the requester.
This, as it's written here, identifies specifically non-releasable information. I know there's also work reviewing for, and I don't have a sense of exactly how often this is the case, but for non-relevant information. So I'm curious, like, how much of this is just about non-releasable, and how much of it is about irrelevant. And Todd, I think I didn't notice your hand was up before I posed that question. You want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we could stay on this very specific topic of emails and searching for non-releasable information, but emails in general, electronic records overall, things like databases, metadata, that's just the new painful frontier of public records where, like Tyler said, a lot of our work resides, where public employees have to spend a lot of time searching it and not necessarily with the expertise or tools necessary. And there really aren't a lot of really great specific tools for doing that. And for requesters who become instantly frustrated with public records requests that seem simple to them, yet take a very long time and end up being expensive because they truly don't understand the depth that public bodies have to like sort of dive into to retrieve these records. And so in addition to, government workers, government agencies, certainly requesters should be included here as interested party, but so should other parts, like other government workers who do not directly process public records requests, like IT departments, who then have to sort of be, brought into the process and expend a fair amount of time going through these records.
Or anyone who might have records, right? Who might have to do that first search themselves.
Well, yes, like individual employees, sure, if there's no centralized system or public bodies rely on their individuals who are named to look for records, all of that. I just want to acknowledge Senator Thatcher has joined us as well. Hello,
Thanks.
Senator.
Glad to have you, Senator. Steve?
I would say this is routinely among the biggest cost drivers in records requests, and I think it frustrates everyone. And the real issue, so there's non-releasable, like discretionary exemptions that one could choose to employ. I think probably the biggest interest that everybody shares is in like compulsory confidential information, PII, sensitive PII, like person's name is PII, it's not sensitive, but person's other elements of PII, such as health conditions, et cetera. And I think there's concerns both in terms of it mucks up our ability to disclose non-sensitive material and our ability to protect sensitive material and people's privacy. And I think the solution, well, I know we're not supposed to be talking about solutions, but it would be easier if we had that information segregated. And it would be more secure if it were segregated. And in fact, I think a lot of IT professionals would agree that the best practice is to keep PII out of email or to explicitly label it with some sort of tagging mechanism and ideally to encrypt it. We all have to go through kind of that rigmarole if we're talking to like our medical providers or financial institutions, but it's to protect our private information. And that would also simplify the process of disclosure if you had some mechanism for segregating things in that fashion. Same is true with databases. If you stipulated that certain fields of the database would only contain PII, and certain fields would not contain any PII, you could skip over that whole step of having to read through every single record to see if it might have somebody's social security number in it.
Steve, you said that this is one of the biggest drivers in costs typically. Is there, I'm just wondering what is that stuff we heard in the testimony, or is that just sort of, yeah, Todd, you're nodding your head.
That's based mainly on my experience, but it's something that's almost always going to be there. You know, even if the records were found really easily, you're still going to have often an assertion of the need to review.
Mm-hmm. And Todd, you have your hand up.
I do. Yeah, I just want to expand a little bit on what we're all saying, because in addition to having to search these records for non-releasable information, they often have to be reviewed manually one by one for responsive information as well, because even if a search can search emails generally, they still have to be reviewed individually, as I believe we've heard in testimony, for the relevant information that's being sought as well. So it becomes what could have been or felt like an automated process to begin becomes a very human and manual process on the back end, for sure.
Does the law address that you only provide records that you are certain are responsive? I mean, the problem, it seems the bigger problem would be releasing non-releasable information that is protected by law. But if you release information that's not relevant, it shifts the burden to the receiver to sort through it, right? So I'm just curious if that's, I'm curious if that's an area that's taking up too much time, you know, as what people's experience might be on that maybe reviewing things more than necessary.
In my experience, Emily, public bodies review records and provide anything responsive, and anything that is caught up in it that's non-responsive but not also confidential tends to get released as well. We don't really have a mechanism by which like a public body can simply provide only responsive records, which would make it easier for the requester. Providing non-responsive stuff, I suppose, speeds it up for the public body, but then ends up giving the requester a lot more work on their end to parse through what's relevant or not. We also don't have anything in the law that says if you find a record that's responsive, do you have to then provide the 12 other records that also have this responsive info, or can you merely provide the one record because that's really what the requester wanted to? Even though the law like permits communication and stuff, it doesn't really incentivize public bodies to sort of stop after finding a responsive record and asking requesters it's enough. They just sort of pull everything, assess the fees, and then leave it up to the requester to decide how they want to proceed. So I'd be interested in seeing something that sort of like deduping and discovery that allows a public body to work with a requester to just give them what they want and not have to keep going and finding everything that answers that same question if it's a type of request that can be answered with a report instead of every report that has the information they're looking for.
That's an interesting point. My question was more I had thought I heard you say that part of the review is to find out whether the information is releasable, and I was wondering whether that is a necessary part of the review.
I mean, I think public bodies will always look for responsive records and provide anything that is a hit that isn't also confidential. I don't think there's a lot of parsing that goes into it beyond that.
Okay, so this part of in this I had added it takes an excessive amount of time to review documents for non-releasable sensitive PII information, and I added this and responsive information. Now I'm a little confused whether responsive information is actually looking to make sure, you know, review, because you said if it also turns into a manual process to review information to make sure it's responsive, which is why I wrote that down. But now I am understanding that you're saying that's not part of the process so much that we need to worry about.
Well, no, I mean, you have to look at it this way. For most public records requests, if a requester in a public body are lucky enough to either be sophisticated enough or communicate enough, they'll at least have search terms and stuff like that. So any record that's a hit, they'll provide. And if there's additional non-responsive information in that record or like that gets caught up with it, that'll be divulged as well. But no one's like communicating for substance. Like I don't like, you know, like I don't just care about terms and dates. I also care about, you know, this result. And that's really the only record I want. As far as I see it, no one really gets that far. So if you do this kind of more rote search that isn't like substance based in a way, I guess you'd say, you're going to catch a lot of stuff that is just part of the responsive record you're providing, and no one's really trying to work through like weeding out what the requester really needs and giving them just that. It's more just like everything that matches these terms. This is what we're going to charge if you're paying. Here's everything, and you get to figure out for yourself like what matters or not.
Is that, do you think, a different concern? Is that maybe a number 7? Think on that while I call on Mark.
Well, I think this goes back to an issue that I think we on the PRAC largely all agree with, which may be one of the few things that we all agree on, and that is it's critical for the requester and for the records custodian to be able to communicate, right? I mean, I think we're all in the agreement that greater communication between the requesting community and the custodians can address many of the challenges that we face, right? I think I see a few head nods. Whether or not you can legislate this, to me, seems a little bit, I don't know. I'm willing, I want to hear the conversation continue, but I also believe that if you have the communication between the requesting community and the custodians, you can sort of separate the wheat from the chaff or chaff, whatever it is. And so my hope is, obviously, at the end of the day, that we can somehow encourage more communication between the requesting community in order to sort of narrow people's requests so that we can be responsive in answering their requests, but also in a more timely fashion. Maybe that's Pollyannish, but that's just sort of my general feeling about this particular topic, because I do think that when you get into electronic data, you know, we can supply reams and reams and reams of paper, but until we have that back and forth dialogue between the requester, you know, again, I think we're going to end up doing two things. We're going to provide the requester more information than they wanted, and as a result, they're going to be charged more in all likelihood because they're getting additional amounts of documents. So I'll shut up at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Todd?
I was going to say, yeah, you know, my whole office is based around improving communication, right, between requesters and public bodies. And I think that goes to the core of any successful law, whether it's something that we introduce that's new or the existing law. But Mark, to your point, you know, a lot of requesters and certainly even a lot of public employees don't even know what that conversation around really complex records requests is supposed to look like, especially when we're talking about large volumes of data. So I am in favor of introducing certain basic requirements into the law about what sort of that beginning conversation or what the parameters of that conversation should be, for instance, around data dictionaries and metadata and things like that, because that's the bare bones framework in which to start a conversation that then hopefully, if everyone's required to talk about the important parts of that type of request, then they'll have a more organic conversation around what's needed and get to a point faster of actually figuring out who needs what, rather than first trying to say, well, you give me data dictionaries, and well, what is a data dictionary? Like, just setting up the basics of that requirement, I think, is something that should be mandated. And then from there, actual real conversations could happen.
There is also, and as a journalist, there's often the issue of not quite sure what information I specifically need. I want to know something, I want to understand a program better. I want to understand the consequences of a decision better. So in that sense, those requests sometimes are more broad than easy to parse out. But that's an interesting area to explore how we could mandate conversations. Just going back to this, does this number 6, excessive amount of time and resources to review electronic documents, communication tools for sensitive information? I mean, I think that's one concept, right? Like, I want to try to keep these really clear what we're talking about, and if some of the solutions may mash over, but I think I'm hearing more than one idea in this. I pulled one out here that Mark mentioned, that the lack of a communication can cause problems that affect costs by not getting the right records or take too much time. I'd like to suggest maybe this idea of, Todd, that you've addressed, that no one's reviewing them to make sure they match what people want. And does that get captured by what I just added for 16? Or this number 6 seems too complex to me. It seems like there's more ideas than one in there. So I'm suggesting taking that out and leaving this as just sensitive information. Does that make sense to people?
If I could, sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, Todd.
I was going to say, it doesn't make sense for me to really separate these out. These reviews aren't really done sort of like, well, let me review it for responsive, let me review it for sensitive or confidential. It's sort of all this rolling process that either one employee does everything, or one employee finds the responsive records and then they send it over to, say, their legal counsel or a manager to find confidential records. But it's all part of the same review process, as far as I understand it. It's more the issue of electronic records that are becoming the largest part of public records requests and the most complicated, with the least understanding and resources, that I see as the issue for number 6, rather than, once you're going through electronic records, what things are you looking for within them?
Steve?
I was just going to note that there are 3 other folks who have their hands up. I'm going to keep my hand up because I have something to say, but I'll go last.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sometimes I cannot see everyone on the screen, so I really appreciate that. I see Emily, you have your hand up. Would you like to go ahead?
Sure. So I really agree with some of the feedback that was given around, one of the points that I was going to make was around, helping people to narrowly tailor those requests and recognizing the challenges that people have. So I think the data dictionaries idea is a good one. Regarding the point that was made about segregating information, and I also agree with Todd that, like, you're going to have to review records for responsiveness at the same time as you are reviewing for PII. But I also don't think, while obviously keeping unencrypted PII out of email would be a best practice, I don't think it's realistic to think that it could ever be fully accomplished either. Even if no public employee ever made a mistake, it still wouldn't control for what information employees could receive from members of the public. So you're never going to be able to eliminate having to review for PII.
I put that in the concerns about solutions problem. Do you want to try to keep going on what the problems are before we decide that a solution will or won't work? But I appreciate that. I think it's important to record people's thoughts about solutions as they come up as well. Let's see. I'm looking at the PRAC members, and I think, Steve, are you the next one with your hand up? I see that a member of the public has their hand up as well.
Yeah, I think there are two members of the public who, and
Okay.
I'd be happy to let them go first.
Okay, I can only see one. I think it's someone named JB.
That may be me, Madam Chair.
It appears so because I think you lit up. Yeah, Joe Barker.
Yeah. My question is dealing with what is classified as sensitive data. Do you include personal comment notes on a report or on an agenda item, first impression? Generally, frame of mind is a protected concept with the courts. Or are we just talking basic sensitive information of address, telephone number?
Well, in this context, what we're talking about is the cost of public records. And so the cost of a review that would look at whatever sensitive information was, whatever information was deemed sensitive under the law to not release. There's very specific legal rules about some stuff that can't be released. But the discussion here is about cost of public records. So anything that would require a review of whatever was determined unreleasable would be part of that cost. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if somebody else wants to quickly address her question about what is public records, but what is releasable and not releasable isn't the question here. It's really more the fact that reviewing for that takes time and cost.
I was just wanting to clarify that's all. Okay.
Yeah.
Just for my own edification and understanding. Thank you, Madam.
Yeah. Let's see. The second member of the public, I cannot see.
He seems to have taken his hand down, and I can't remember the name.
Okay, so please come back if you were the one who was waiting to speak. My Zoom covered your name with the little icon tray, so I apologize for that. Steve, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of reviewing for responsive information, it seems like, legally, you're on the hook as a public body if you don't release responsive information. But there's no penalty or reason not to release unresponsive or irrelevant information. And as a requester, I generally would not want you to spend time getting rid of irrelevant information because I'm going to be charged for it. I'd rather you do the simplest thing and just, go wide if that's going to cost less.
So that sounds like it might be a problem that would, if there wasn't enough communication about what you were looking for, that could create that kind of problem. Is that right, Steve? We're just trying to figure out where to put this
I guess
concern, or what you're just trying to clarify that the kind of searching.
I think what Todd was saying is that it would be nice if the public body had an incentive to narrow the response. So it would be helpful to the requester because the requester doesn't have to read through a bunch of irrelevant material. And I agree that would be nice, but there's a cost to that. I would think it's more costly for the public body to narrow down the pile of paper than to simply give the requester the whole thing. So I'm not sure that it's a problem, the review for responsiveness.
Okay. So on this number 6, do we need to leave this review for responsiveness right in this problem? It sounds like there's some different views on whether, well, I guess we can agree that spending time to review for responsive information takes time and money, and there's a question as to whether that's the best use of resources, period. So maybe a solution would be to address how that's done. So I'm answering my own question here. I think what I've done now kind of captures it best. Any other people feel comfortable with how number 6 is written now? And any other thoughts on that? Comments? And I'm looking at your hands, Tyler.
Yeah, and I know you're trying to keep this limited to one topic, so I'll do my best. But I do think it's worth pointing out, since in the context of cost drivers, it says it takes an excessive amount of time and resources, but I might also add expertise from the public body side. I mean, that we talked about, you might have one employee looking at, pulling together your set, but then, as was pointed out, you might be sending it for a legal review elsewhere. And obviously, I think that adds to the cost of these requests.
Okay, so it's more like it takes an excessive amount of time, resources, and expertise to review documents. Some of the drivers in this include electronics, the releasable information, the review of responsive information. Mark?
Yeah, Emily, I only have one. It's a little editorial in the middle column. You say PRR. I think it's PII, right?
That was public records requests.
Oh, forgive me. Okay. I figured there was PRR and PII.
But yeah.
Thank you.
Tyler, do you still have your hand up, or is that from last time? Down. Okay.
Sorry.
That's cool. I need 2 screens. Okay, so how do people feel about number 6? Are we capturing the concern correctly now? It takes excessive amount of time, resources, and expertise to review documents, and then a list of what some of those reasons that it takes time are. All right, are we good to go on to number 7? Does anybody want to say anything else about number 6? Let's look at number 7. It's difficult sometimes to determine which public body or section of one large public body holds what records. I know this is definitely a problem for requesters because they get the runaround. That's not mine, go to them. Oh, that's not mine, go back to the one you were. Oh, that's not mine. Oh, I've never heard of this sub-agency of my agency, even though you're looking at the webpage. So I know it's a requester's pain point. Anyone else want to weigh in on number 7? Mark.
Forgive me, because I'm also in the middle of eating my lunch, so
Please.
Sorry about that. Statute already requires that each public body posts their public records policy. And in that, if I recall correctly, and I'm looking to Todd, that there's a point of contact for public records requests. And I see that Todd and Steve are both looking to respond to this. I think part of the problem is that not every local government body has actually probably posted their policies, which I think is regrettable. And I think that we in local government need to do a better job sharing with our members that, these requirements exist and that you need to do a better job for those of you who aren't. I think that would resolve a lot of these problems. At the same time, you look at a large organization, whether it be the state or the city of Portland or what have you, these are very, very large government entities that a single point of contact isn't going to know necessarily, right, where a record exists. And so it's my feeling that we need to, at the local government level and frankly the state level, to ensure that public bodies are posting these policies and that they're designating individuals to be the point of contact. Whether or not we can resolve the issue of, I don't know who actually holds the record in a big organization. I don't know if you can legislate a fix to that. But I do think that the existing requirements in statute for having a single point of contact and having a policy is something that is on the books, but is not necessarily fully implemented, and we need to do a better job on that point. Thank you.
Scott? Thank you, Mark.
I agree with what Mark has mentioned, and I would say that this number 7 is also a concern for government records responders. At the city level, we get asked all the time because people think that the cities have marriage certificates or death certificates or property records, which are all county or state. So I think it cuts both ways. And big picture, I think there's a lot of civics learning that has been forgotten by much of the public, and they come to a certain level of government not realizing it somewhere else, and there's sometimes just geography. We are mistaken in Milwaukee all the time for being much bigger than we are, and our city limits are much smaller. So there's a certain amount of ongoing learning that we will have to provide, but I definitely think it's a problem for government too, for the government responders. I mean,
Todd? Thanks, Scott.
Well, Steve, I mean, Mark largely said what I was going to say, which is a lot of public bodies don't have policies up, or if they do, they don't mention everything they're supposed to, like the basis for how they charge fees or who their records custodians are with contact information. I know we're not leaning too heavily into solutions right now, but one thing you'll see in my draft proposal is that if a public body does not have a publicly posted policy that includes how fees are calculated, then they cannot charge fees. I realize that's a pretty strong position to make. Included it as much as a conversation starter as anything else to get at points like these. But I do think it's really important that we find a way to work with public bodies to have these policies posted so that some of these questions can be addressed directly even before a requester has to engage with a public employee.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. Mark, do you still have your hand up or just no? Okay. Tyler?
Yeah, and I think I would echo what previous speakers have said, but I think also it's worth pointing out, like in the example that you provided originally, Emily, speaking up for public officials, I think because we've sort of talked in the past in these meetings about how like the FOIA model rests on a professionalized public records official. So I think it's in some cases, sure, it might be nefarious, but more often than not, I think it's because there is no clear point of contact because it's not somebody's full-time duty to be a public records respondent. They might well be an administrator or a manager or a public relations, So again, I would echo what Mark has said about we could do a much better job with education. I would echo what Scott has said about, more broadly, civics education at large would help as well. But again, one of the cost drivers that I see associated with this particular bullet point is the lack of a professionalized, dedicated public records staff. And I'm not advocating for that because we certainly wouldn't want somebody sitting there just waiting for something to come in, but it absolutely drives costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't felt in the example I gave that it was nefarious as much as it was just deadly on the time consuming, because I wouldn't get the answer that they weren't the agency with the record until the full allotted time for response had passed. And by then, you can imagine. Yeah. So, but yes, that's a good point that, and I fully understand that people aren't always focused on that. So that one seems pretty simple. And Steve, you wanted to jump in on this one. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, I agree with Tyler, and I think basically those specialists become essentially like reference librarians because they get the same types of requests pretty frequently, and they learn which agency has the thing or which subcomponent of which agency and what that form is called and everything, and I think it's really helpful.
Any other comments on this number 7? Any members of the public have a comment on this topic? All right, that one seems pretty straightforward. Let's go on to number 8. fees don't cover the true costs of responding to records requests. We did hear that over and over in testimony. Think about who that affects. It certainly would seem to affect agencies because they'd need to find the budget elsewhere. Other thoughts on number 8? Steve?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo, I guess, or repeat what we heard from some of the witnesses. City of Portland, I recall, cited, tried to estimate the full cost of compliance with public records law, and came up with $2.8 million for a year in direct, I guess this is direct personnel costs, including in fully loaded overhead, but that's simply the people who are actually like gathering the records. It was couched as a conservative estimate, and the city collected $500,000 in fees that same year, about half of it from commercial requesters and half not. So clearly not covering that cost. State of Oregon, in the Records Advocate survey from 2019, I went back and tabulated the fees that were collected from the 53 agencies that track them at the state level. And the total for the record was $189,666. We don't know the true cost of compliance for those state agencies, like how much of their costs they ate, but presumably it's a good deal more than that. I guess I bring that up to say I think it's important context when we talk about, we've talked about concerns about if fees were further waived or eliminated. I mean, that's kind of like the maximum of what the loss is to public bodies if we were to eliminate them. And on the flip side, it's like, it's nowhere near what the actual cost is. So just to put it all in context, like, it's not like fees are really helping that much right now for public bodies. I mean, at least in terms of making them whole financially. We can talk about kind of deterrence effects and leverage for negotiation over fees, but they're not actually paying for the cost of disclosure as of now, unless we were to increase them.
Tyler?
Sorry, while I'm
Yeah.
If I may add to that, I think this also just sort of speaks to, like, I think we really need to have as part of the discussion the issue of funding. The fact that we don't know exactly what it costs for public bodies to do these sorts of things, and that it is an important function of government that we want to budget for. And so, I mean, certainly at the state level, I think, again, not getting too far ahead of myself, but I think it would be helpful if, for example, in the budgetary process at the state level, if there were some sort of line item for public records disclosure, to actually think formally about how we're going to plan for this.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Tyler?
Yeah, I think under affected parties for this, I mean, I would put like citizens at large, and I think what I'm getting at is that for a local government, especially with a small budget, if you're responding to something and you haven't budgeted for it, obviously those dollars are coming from elsewhere, and that could come from services that would otherwise be going out to the community. I mean, that's the reality of kind of the wonky and wacky way that we fund local government here in Oregon. It's perpetually underfunded. So every dollar, that we do spend on something that's particularly unaccounted for does get cut from something else it could have gone to. So this is certainly transparency is obviously a great value, a great goal. But the reality is, yeah, if it's not budgeted for, that's a dollar that could have gone to some other sort of service for the citizens.
Tyler, is our public records not budgeted for?
I'm saying if we're talking about unaccounted for costs, I mean, we don't know if you were to get a public records request like at a county level, you know, and it was like everything under the sun. Obviously, during the budget process, right, you might not say, hey, we're going to get hit with, you know, there's no way to know what you don't know ahead of the time. So certainly something I could foresee an instance where you get, or there's just a huge breaking story and suddenly, you know, you're having to spend way more time in terms of your employees' time or duplication or whatever the cost might be that might not have been built into whatever the budget was. I'm just saying above and beyond. Not that they don't plan for these things. I'm sure there's contingencies, but it's going to vary. I mean, certainly it's going to vary across each and every distinct budget out there.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So if you hit with a very large request, maybe a breaking news story like COVID, which hit in so many different ways, or maybe someone who is just very insistent on many records. So those kinds of unpredictable events. Is that what you're talking about, Tyler?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you. Others on this on this pain point of fees not covering the costs of responding to records requests?
Emily, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to, but you're not sharing anymore. I just wanted to point that out.
I'm not.
At least on my screen. At least on my screen.
Really?
I still see it. I still see
weird.
it.
Okay, I guess it's a me thing. Sorry.
You should see just the document. Is that correct? Because it shows on my screen I'm only sharing the document, not the rest of my desktop. Is that right? Like you guys can't see yourself on Zoom on my desktop?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I realized I fumbled my screen. It's me. It's not you.
Okay.
But I do have a response here as well, if
Please.
I may. I do think this affects requesters as well, because since public bodies are not being fully recouped, my takeaway from some of their testimony is that they're really feeling the pressure of not having adequate funding and therefore resources, staff, et cetera, which I think leads to less fee waivers and reductions, less willingness to waive the first 30 to 60 minutes of work and things like that, because they're already feeling so under the gun and so underfunded. They're less inclined in individual requests they do handle to be more open about their fee structure as a result. I mean, I've seen on some websites from public bodies that say like they'll never offer a fee waiver or reduction because of other conflicting cost constraints. And so not funding their system at the outset fully, I think, adds to that pressure and therefore affects requesters.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. Other comments on number 8? Okay. All right, number 9, people responsible for responding to public records requests often have other more primary duties. Seems like we've talked about this in other contexts, so maybe that's already somewhere else we can get rid of this one. For example, the chair of a volunteer board or mayor whose primary responsibilities are governance, or a PIO whose primary responsibility is communicating information or the perspective the agency wants to share. And this was in contrast to the federal government approach. Okay, we have talked about this some. Comments here, do we need to keep this as it is or fold it in somewhere else? Sorry, checking people. I'm just going to scroll to look what we did. I don't think that's kind of in this as a, recognition of why other problems are happening. So it's kind of, it kind of circles back. I guess that just signals that this isn't a special pain point because it meshes with different ones. But does anybody have any comments on this? Seems like it would affect everybody, right? In the same ways as seen above.
I have to add one comment.
Please,
If I may. I have to jump off in a few minutes. I'm sorry about that, but I did maybe another category, maybe a number 16 could be the concern about there not being enough education to individual requesters, especially people who don't do this professionally. And maybe but maybe something around that would be a good topic to add. Sorry, I didn't think about it sooner, but I've heard it being brought up continually during this meeting. So
a lack of education about the process.
About the process, how to make an appropriate request that gets to what they want without making it too overly broad and burdensome to the agencies, but then also going to the correct places for records, and going back to the civics lessons that I also heard being mentioned.
Great. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I've added that, except for I can't spell it right yet. There we go. And that is kind of like this number 9, in that it seems like crossover in problem recognized in other problems. Just jumping back up to the number 9, any further comment on this one? I mean, the idea is, we'll consolidate these and see where they match and see where solutions can solve a number of problems at once. But on this number 9, anybody else want to respond or comment? Okay. Number 10, some public bodies have limited budgets for routine good public record management practices, such as legal reviews. This has also come up as in number 6 as the time, records, and expertise. I don't know if that would stop the time thing, but the limited budgets, and it's a little bit, that's legal practices, but routine good public management practices, that might be a little bit different actually than number 6, which is more about reviewing. Mark.
I would say that there are some public bodies that have no budgets for routine good public records management practices. Again, as a reminder, I've got 950 districts. The vast majority of those have budgets less than 100,000, and about 30% of our membership has a budget of less than $50,000. I can assure you that those with less than $50,000 budgets that are primarily volunteer rural fire departments are not budgeting for public records requests.
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, so some of it I think is lack of, I guess you can say lack of foresight or lack of resources, but I think it's also what Tyler alluded to is like lack of demand. Like why do you have this dedicated records officer if you get a request once every 5 years or something? Lack of need or lack of demand causes them to do. But I mean, not to jump ahead to solutions, but I do think to the extent it's desirable to have specialization and professionalization of records management. I think at one point we kind of batted around or alluded to the idea of some sort of regional solution or something at the state level that would be available as a service to multiple small districts or small counties that don't have that high of a volume. Just throwing that out there.
Okay. Tyler?
Yeah, and thank you, Steve, for that comment, because again, I think what we're talking about here are the surprise requests. Like when we say routine in there, that may well be accounted for, but what do you do when there's something that you couldn't have seen coming, and the requests go through the roof? And to that degree, again, I think we're kind of talking about risk pooling to some degree and having a funding mechanism for when something above and beyond happens. There is sort of a common way to address that that doesn't put the burden all on the affected body.
Okay. if there's no response on number 10, I'm just noticing that number 11 is very similar. It's taking a slightly different slice of the time frame. Many public bodies don't have money in their budgets for public management practices that could reduce the cost of compliance long term, such as digitizing and modernizing systems. Like Mark, you've spoken eloquently about how, you know, some of these smaller places just have never had that opportunity, so their records are still paper, or you know, in different software programs because, you know, it's been upgraded once and nobody changed them over because there wasn't money for that sort of thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the Water Resources Department is a perfect example at the state. They have literally, well, I think some 84,000 water rights. Guess where they are? A good number of them are still on paper in a file cabinet in the basement where you need a Fedora in order to go through the Raiders of the Lost Ark to get to those records. So it's not a problem just for small government. This is a problem for the state as well. So this is a universal problem for sure.
Should we combine this 10 and 11? Steve?
Yeah, I think that'd be fine, but I do think capturing both ideas, calling attention to the inability to do this long-term stuff is good. I was just going to mention that again, if I'm remembering correctly, I think DEQ said that by digitizing a certain number of records, they had reduced their requests by like 20%, which is pretty phenomenal for given the number of, you know, they get 4,000 or 5,000 requests a year. So it's definitely desirable if it's possible to make that investment. It saves everybody. And Mark, I'm pretty sure actually that the Water Resources Board has digitized those water rights because I've actually read them online, including ones going back to the 1900s.
Thanks, Steve. Mark, is your hand back up?
Yeah, I don't want to debate whether or not they're all digitized or not, but I do know that they do have to go and do paper searches oftentimes, Steve. So, and I think that that's still the case. I know that they have been working on digitizing, though. I think that it would be a tremendous help to a lot of local governments if there were state funds available for this effort to help local governments, you know, sort of streamline and digitize their records. But knowing the state budget and things of that nature, there are a lot of competing, of course, interests and needs out there. But I do think that might be, and I don't like suggesting solutions as Steve has attempted to avoid it. I do think that suggesting that some kind of state funding to assist local governments, whether it be match or whatnot, would be a real big help, because at the end of the day, as everybody has sort of pointed out, if you can get access to this stuff electronically, it's going to save enormous amount of personnel time and as a result, costs. So I do think that that's worthy for further exploration. Thank you.
Scott?
I think I raised my hand just last. I think Steve and Tyler were in front of me.
Thank you. Steve?
That was a mistake.
Okay, Tyler?
Well, I think after practices in this problem statement, we could also put or infrastructure. I mean, that's what I'm thinking about is like, there are some things, that's getting into solution territory, but like there are some things where if we could just provide the tool, which might be a big upfront capital outlay cost, you might be saving a lot of time. I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, when the pandemic hit and there was, you know, much ink was spilled over the employment department's processes, and it was talking about how outdated the infrastructure was. And that in turn, from their practical side, that meant a lot of work had to be done by hand, which added to cost, which added to time, which added to pain felt around the state. So calling out specifically, we're not just talking about having the people to actually do the digitizing. We could also be talking about tools that exist out there today, where if we could just upgrade that physical infrastructure, we could do it. But I would share Mark's observation that, you know, again, a budget is constrained, and every dollar you spend on something is something you can't do on something else. So there's always going to be that tension of, you know, is upgrading this computer system the best use of our limited public funds?
Mm-hmm. I guess that's where potentially, I mean, I know public funds at the state level are also obviously constrained. You can only spend each dollar once, but it would alleviate maybe a little bit of pressure off a smaller government. Not to get ahead to solutions. Scott.
Yeah, and in that vein, also not to get ahead to solutions, but maybe a subset under state funds is there is, and to call out our colleagues at the state archives, they do a tremendous amount of records assistance for free for governments of all levels, and they've come to a number of cities and done that. And full disclosure, my city is a part of the user of a state-run administered software program that does a lot of the work as a tool that a lot of has been mentioned by the council. There is a model out there. There are other options that agencies can use, but some of these tools have already been implemented by state, and it is actually a very effective program, and our colleagues at State Archives do tremendous work. So perhaps part of what PRAC can do is encourage the state to enhance State Archives programming and services. Not as a complete solution, but as something that is already seeing success today.
Great, thank you, Scott. Okay, any other comments on 11?
I just wanted to follow up on what Scott just said. Can you say more about this State Archives thing? Is it like something that local governments can go to the state archives and just hand over documents to be digitized, or how does it work?
Sure, I can espouse on it, Todd, if you know more, since you were recently in that office too. But yeah, maybe two halves. As the state archivists for public records across the state, they provide, you know, free advice, counseling, and services for any level of government. I've known cities, there have been various programs. I can't speak for certainty that they're doing it now, but there have been cases where state archives took city records of a certain age and stored them for them. So there's that ongoing programming, and then the work of offering records management advice and guidelines. They're also the ones who maintain the OARs for the retention schedules for the various levels of government, and that in itself is part of an ongoing training and revising process. So there's that part of it. And then I think it's maybe close to 15 years old, but there's a program that the state archives have run called the Oregon Records Management Solution, ORMS, which runs an instance of the Hewlett-Packard product that's been spun off, and now it's called Content Manager, but a really robust electronic records management system, an ERMS, that they run, that other big agencies, City of Portland, Metro, Multnomah County, run the same software, but the state, in partnership with a group called Chavs Consulting out of Baker City, run this ORMS, Oregon Records Management Solution, and it's a shared environment. So I think they've added 40 in the last year. I just heard yesterday or this week. There's maybe approaching 200 agencies, all level of governments, districts, school districts, cities, counties that are in this shared space that we share some of the administrative costs and running. And it's a per seat. So if your city wants 10 people in this system, you pay a certain amount fee per seat per month. So that's a model of how it can be tailored to different sizes of governments. It's been a great program. Again, full disclosure, the city of Milwaukee was one of the pilot program agencies for that about 14 years ago, and we've found great success with it. So that's a nutshell. It's sort of rambling. I apologize, Steve. I can try to be more articulate if you have more specific questions, and certainly I'll defer to Todd or others who know about that program.
Thank you very much. Todd has his hand up, in fact.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, Scott, you handled that way better than I could. You know a lot more about that program than I do. My experience has been more tangential, although I've thought about perhaps implementing that program for our own office. But much like any other solution, there's a cost to it. And that's where, again, not getting too deep into solutions, but some sort of centralized funding, pass-through funding, some measure of assisting local governments that don't have the means to pay per seat to use ORMS could be helpful, because ORMS, the system that Scott is talking about, has both back of the house applications that are incredibly helpful, and I believe also engagement with the community as well. There's features there that can be implemented, and it is a great system. It's definitely one that should be explored. It's not perfect, it doesn't do everything, but it can be useful if a public body can pay for it. But just to Scott's other point, yes, so there are free services out there to educate public bodies, right? Including my office, and I often work very closely with state archives, and we trade questions back and forth, because I typically say in my trainings, archives will talk to you about what you do when you create or receive a record, and I'll talk to you about what to do when someone comes looking for it. So these free services are out there. We work hand in hand to provide this information to public bodies. And if maybe one thing that we want to consider as an alternative to legislation is exploring how to beef up what both archives and my office can do in the education sphere, or even in helping public bodies understand what their technology options are out there, and even going so far as to working to come up with centralized funding as well.
Great. Anybody else comments on number 11? Number 12, we've also gotten at in sort of bits. Some public bodies are responding to public records requests as a distraction from their core mission. We've heard this in testimony a number of times, where people have testified that people are they have more important things to do that are first priority services, or that any time filling a public records request takes away from the time that somebody, their primary job responsibilities. So I guess that would affect agencies who need to whose employees need to be split, and responders, requesters who I guess I feel like that maybe just comes to maybe the tension point, right? Maybe that's just more of a, people are affected by, I wouldn't say this is universal at all, but the sense of bother, I guess. Maybe it's a tension point that doesn't have to be there, but is at the moment. Other comments? Todd?
I was going to say public body leadership, I think, would be an affected group here, because in my conversations with some of them, or with frontline staff who do this work, it's the leadership who really has to fund these systems. And if they see public records as a distraction from their otherwise important work, they're not going to be invested in getting this work done. And so I don't know if it's a matter of incentivizing them through the law or education or both, but I definitely think public body leadership needs to be brought on board and convinced of why this is not a distraction, but yet another core aspect of their work that needs to be supported.
Tyler?
Yeah, and I think I would, at least from the county side of things, I would push back on the characterization of it as a distraction. And again, I think I'd just take it a level higher and say, essentially, public bodies are overworked and underfunded. I mean, that's, you just have so many competing priorities all the time, that to me feels like the ultimate cost driver, not so much how I feel about this one essential duty, because most of the people I talk to recognize that this is an essential duty of government, and they say we would love to do it, but we have to do all of these other things as well.
I think we heard that in some of the testimony, but I felt like we did definitely hear prioritizing, within the agency where, and you have to do that when you have a limited budget. But I think I'm just a little concerned that by taking it that large, that public bodies are overworked and underfunded, we are going to get to a place where there is no solution, because that is a reality that is is really part of the dialogue in any public debate about any issue. So maybe we can refine this to some way to keep it focused on public records and identify what the issue is a little better. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a little more value neutral would be to say, rather than as a distraction, as taking money away from their core mission or taking resources away. Because I think that's, I mean, both, that's what's driving it. That's the assertion. Now, I
think the core mission though part, sorry, go ahead. I thought you were finished.
Well, I mean, people, agencies often point to their major public services, like, providing immunizations and protecting or fighting wildfires. And, a dollar not spent there, spent on public records takes away from that. So I think that's kind of how I view it. Now, I mean, what's interesting is like Michael Crone, who's not here today, I don't think, has said it repeatedly. Well, you can point to the dollar taken away from immunization, or you can point to a dollar taken away from the public information officer that you have on staff, who's putting out the agency's perspective. So I think examining, well, I'm not sure what my point is with that. We can point to different types of expenditures that are going on within an agency and what their merits are. But I think the point is that the public, there is a legitimate point to be made about do we have enough money to deliver services that people need, and what is the prioritization?
I think what maybe I'm hearing you suggest by referring to what Michael's brought up in the past is that another way to, maybe the appropriate way to word it here, this is really just throwing an idea out there, is because what I'm hearing from the government agency folks is that, we have lots of core missions, and understandably the core mission of the fire department is to fight fires. But there's a lot of demands. Maybe should this be more focused on money public records request is taking away from other public information goals or something like that? Should we try to put it more in the public information department goals and missions?
Sorry, if I could respond to that, Emily, that's not what I was suggesting with what I was saying about Michael. I mean, you could also, rather than saying core mission, if that's a concern, you could just say from other important public services.
Mark, put your hand down. So does that mean that's what you were going to suggest too? Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, this one's kind of nebulous to me. Citing our new telescope up in the space, my reaction to number 12 is yes, I agree that we have heard testimony that some feel that asking for public records is a distraction for the public entity, and that may be a fair characterization. I think what the challenge here is that government, particularly from my perspective, local government, has been facing a revenue challenge since ballot measure 5 and 50 were passed. All right, and I'm sorry to go down the history books with you all here, but we're only permitted to, our revenues only increase a maximum of 3% a year, adding on new development. That simply does not keep pace with the cost of doing business. Healthcare and pensions far outstrip a 3% increase every year. The bottom line, so I'm going to cut this real short. The bottom line is local government is increasingly struggling to meet their missions of providing services because the revenue that they are receiving to deliver those services, despite what a lot of people would think, are actually shrinking in relative terms. And so over time, providing those services, as Tyler described, is becoming increasingly challenged. And when unanticipated cost drivers are being realized, it becomes even more difficult to deliver those services, and difficult decisions have to be made, folks. This is a bigger problem than just public records, okay? I want to make that very clear. There are a lot of other very important programs that are facing similar challenges. So this isn't just reserved to public records, okay? Suggesting that that records are a distraction, no, they're a cost driver, okay? They're a cost driver, and a lot of local governments are really struggling on an annual basis of fulfilling the expectations of their citizens. I'm sorry I went into platitudes and overarching issues, but these are the major pressures that our local governments are facing. And I don't agree necessarily with the claim that local governments feel that public records requests are a distraction. Quite the contrary. I think that providing public records for most local governments is a part of their core responsibilities. But balancing all these responsibilities with the finite amount of money that is available is becoming increasingly challenging and difficult. I'm sorry for the lecture here, but that's reality.
Thank you, Mark. Steve?
I think that's reasonable, and I mean, I would agree that this is kind of a nebulous assertion, and the more I look at it, I mean, I can't speak for all requesters, but I mean, I think it is nebulous, and I'm not sure that necessarily this pain point furthers the discussion a great deal. I mean, I think it's covered in some of the other points, and it's kind of a meta issue, really. It's like, you know, things cost money, and we need to decide how it's going to get paid for and who pays for it. And so I'd be fine if we just, you know, put it aside.
Thank you, Steve. Tyler?
Sure. Just as I'll be brief, but I'll build off Mark. I mean, I just wanted to say, you know, when you're putting together a local budget, the biggest portion of it's property taxes, which are capped. We've had other revenue sources that have been preempted by the state. We have federal or state transfers to local government, which we largely don't have much control over. And so fees are the one tool that you have where you can set your policy. And building off of that, I want to be clear, even those are not revenue makers. We are allowed under the law to recoup actual costs. And we've already talked about how we don't even come close to recouping actual costs. But I think the fact that you are capped basically in those other categories of your property tax receipts and of transfers, it leads to more policies like Todd has described, where you just say, we're not granting waivers. We just don't do it because we have to be able to recoup actual cost.
Okay. I will note that this says some public bodies, not all in this wording, and it's clearly a pain point because you know, there's a lot of depth to the response to this. I do not have a problem setting this aside, but I do feel that I heard in a lot of testimony that agencies felt they had more important things to do. And so I think this, you know, potential solution that Todd mentioned, there may be room for something like that in any kind of education policy. We've talked about like making sure that policies are online. We've talked about making sure that citizens understand the best way to do a public records request. And there may be room for something like, making sure that leadership does recognize that role of transparency. So I'm not sure. Let's discuss further. Tyler? Somebody's got their mic open. Tyler. Somebody has their mic open. I'm not sure who it is, but I think it's Sherry LaFour.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I can hear you typing. I see your mic's not off. Tyler or Todd, did you want to? Sorry, your hands went down, but did you guys want to say something? And then Mark, of course, you can go ahead. Okay, Todd or Tyler don't want to. Mark, go ahead.
It's not important. Let's move on. Thank you.
Well, should we strike this and retain just this concept of leadership somehow?
I'll speak up. Clearly, there's a perception in the public that some feel that making public records requests is a burden. Okay, and I'm not going to discount that feeling. I mean, I'm sure that there are bad interactions between requesters and custodians that happen for whatever reason. And I think we need to recognize that there are some people that get frustrated with the process, but I just don't know whether or not there's a real solution to this. One other thing I would just add. We at SDAO do training for newly elected board members. And a portion of that has to do with public records and the importance of being open and transparent to the public. Because I think we would all agree that having an open, transparent government leads to more confidence with the public in what their government is doing. And that's a really, really critical point, because oftentimes those local governments are going to have to go to their voters for a levy or a bond or what have you. And so we at SDAO try to make those connections for elected officials in saying that, your future is going to in part depend on how the public perceives you. And if they perceive you as being secretive, they're going to be suspicious. Whereas if you're open and transparent, they're more likely to be supportive of the directions that you're rowing. And we really emphasize that. So I know that at least for us at the districts, we do emphasize those sort of dots and connecting them so that these newly elected officials can sort of understand that interplay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Steve?
So I don't know if this fits with the problems or pain points formulation, but it seems like there's agreement that, like as Mark said, disclosure of public records is a core public service. It is, it is important for, it's a core government function. And there may be widespread agreement on that. Or am I putting words in your mouth, Mark, or is that, I see you shaking your head. That's what I heard you saying. And that's what you're communicating to the people that you're training. So if there's agreement on that, I think if there's some opportunity in whatever we deliver to the legislature, maybe just to communicate that is a value that we agree on, I think that would be useful. That the disclosure needs to be recognized as a core public service, and perhaps that gets into the funding issue, but it's a statement of belief and values.
Yeah, I personally feel that it is a core function of government. I mean, the statute is very clear, right, Steve? at the very beginning of the public records law, you know, that this state strives to make records open to the public. That's a pretty straightforward directive, but I can't speak for Tyler or Scott, excuse me. But I do believe that the way it happens is that public bodies are responsible for being responsive to their citizenry.
Joe
Have a hand
Barker.
from the public.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe Barker.
I'm sorry, wait a minute. My camera doesn't want, oh, there I go. Sorry. Speaking to what Mark said at the beginning of the public records request, and looking at the tools that Steve and Todd were also referencing, it seems to me that with a lot of the records being electronic, that those should actually be made available to the public online, which would cut down a lot of records requests and going through things like your budget. It's supposed to be online. One city I know that I spoke with, they have proclamations, resolutions. They have their monthly closeout, you know, their monthly check registry listed, the whole 9 yards. That would save a lot of time and issue there with fulfilling records requests. And the only thing that would actually have to be focused on, and I'm being simplistic here, would be email communications or supplemental document reports that are back behind something like in an EIR or EIS statement. But, you know, it goes back to the expense of expanding the tools threshold and cloud implementation, I guess. I don't know.
Thank you, Joe. I've without going into solutions, like we keep saying, I've just noted that in a couple places where that might, you know, fit into some of the pain points that we've recognized. But does anybody want to comment on that? Anybody from the PRAC? Okay, thanks, Joe. So with this number 12, there's a couple things we could do with it. We could, you know, cross it off right now. We could let this sit, and my hope with this is to make this into a more useful document by, you know, consolidating things where they seem to fit together, and you know, go forward looking at that way. So this is just a working document that'll get us to another document. So we could leave it now to see if there's anything worth carrying over. We could agree that this isn't something that is a shared pain point now. What do people want to do? Todd?
I'm in favor of leaving it. I wholeheartedly agree with other statements that this is not every public body. It most certainly is not. I've worked with plenty of leaders in government that have bent over backwards to get records out, but there definitely are those who don't see public records as a priority or part of their core mission. And to the extent that we can come up with solutions that requires or incentivizes a public official to do anything, I think this is worth leaving and considering and working toward.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Anybody else want to comment? Joe Barker, do you have your hand up again? Oh, hang on a second. Tyler's raised his hand.
Sure. I think with that distinction being made of, yes, there's going to be a difference. I just think it's worth noting at this point, this is a critical juncture where we got to start thinking of, okay, well, if this is going to lead to a legislative brainstorm, who then are we trying to make this work for? Are we thinking of the people who are, you know, flagrantly violating? Are we thinking of the people who are bending over backwards? Because I think you're going to come to different solutions based on, you know, what's the problem we're going to try to solve. And I know that'll be a much later discussion, but it's worth noting at this point, I think this is a part where my brain starts splitting in two and saying, all right, are we focused on, you know, willful violations, or are we focused on building, you know, a better system for the people who are doing the best that they can right now?
That's a really great point, Tyler. I have a couple thoughts I'd like to share on that. One is, you know, I know this is the legislative subcommittee, but it may be that we identify things that the best solution that we can come up with is actually not legislative, and it wouldn't belong in a proposal that we would send to the legislature. We've got another subcommittee. We could, you know, even bring non-legislative solutions back to the greater PRAC. So I think there's an outlet for that. And the second piece, where, you know, yes, are we, when we think about legislation, are we legislating for the outliers, or are we legislating for the, you know, the mass, right? The general practices, the best practices for the widest good. You know, I think that's a really important question, because a lot of the pain points that we heard in testimony were actually around outlier type of situations. So it's a very important question. Like, if you think about, you know, requests that really put an extreme burden on agencies, and if you think about that example from Connecticut of how they dealt with it, that was a move that was specifically designed to solve that problem. So it was very focused on that problem, and in fact, you know, it was a law that was put into place, an agency that was put into place to deal with that. But that is very much, you know, a small number of requesters, and yet it's a big pain problem. So yeah, I think it's a really good question that may apply, you know, in a couple different junctures in these pain points we've identified. So my comments. Tyler, do you want to respond to this?
I'll learn to take my hand down at some point, I promise.
Do anybody else have thoughts about that? This idea of, yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tyler has sort of put his finger on it. What's the trigger, right? What's the trigger of determining who's feeling like it's a distraction versus who is working as though it's a core function of their body? I do have a quick question, whether or not Tyler or Scott, are you know, do the counties and cities also provide training for newly elected officials? And I would imagine that public records is a component of that training as well. You know, so I do think, and we don't have anybody from the school boards here, but I would imagine that they would also have a similar training module, if you will, regarding public records. But perhaps one of the, and again, sorry about talking about solutions, but there may be a solution that the 4 local government entities can work together with in order to ensure that we're having consistent and meaningful training for those newly elected officials. I think that the part of the challenge, though, is that, you know, these newly elected officials or officials who have served for a long time and need refreshers, right? That maybe a requirement is after every certain amount of period of time, you know, local officials need to have a refresher course. It's sort of like a continuing education for individuals. Now, of course, that again costs money, right? But maybe some of these issues go away as a result of this. So I think the public's perception is important. And as I've stated previously, there probably are non-legislative solutions to this. I think this is an important topic. It's probably going to fall in the non-legislative sphere, but I agree with Todd that we should probably keep it on, because if it's in the public's perception, it's reality. And as a result, I don't think we should lose sight of this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Any other comments on this number 12 then? Okay, number 13. Defining media for the purposes of interacting with government is not appropriate in a democracy. I might suggest a change to that along the lines of is difficult to do, or is a slippery slope, or I mean, although the FOIA does provide an example of a very broad definition, so maybe it's not such a slippery slope. Anyway, those are my initial reactions to this one. Other people? Mark, please go ahead.
Well, I know that there are some states who have defined media, and I realize that this is a highly sensitive issue, particularly when you're talking about cost waivers. My perception, and I'll get a little bit too broad here, I think two of our biggest challenges are defining what is in the public interest, and the issue of a public body may reduce fees, right? I think that's sort of the crux of some of the challenges that we face and why we're going through this whole exercise. What I do think, though, is if we're going to have some type of assumption that the media is working in the public interest, and I've stated my position on this subject before, there needs to be some kind of method to avoid Joe Sixpack from being able to claim the same sort of position, if you will, when in fact they're only seeking records for a personal reason. That's been my fear, okay? And I realize from the media that the media's requests represent a pretty small proportion of the overall public records requests that come through. But I do think that if you build into the statute some kind of automatic reduction for the media, that people are going to seize upon that and try to utilize that as a way to get reduced costs. I'm hopeful that we can find a way, and I have some thoughts on it, about, at least legitimizing that these people who claim that they're with the media have some, way to ensure that, or assure the government that they in fact are gathering information for the purposes of reporting, and how that's done. I think can look in be a variety of different ways. I recognize that you folks are very, very cautious and concerned about defining media in the statute, and I recognize that. I think that there are some other ways that we can get at this challenge, though, because I think it's real. I really do. I think that if you provide an automatic cost reduction for media requests, that other people are going to try to take advantage of it.
Thank you, Mark. Any other thoughts on this? See, Steve.
Just speaking as a member of the media, I think there is not a single journalistic. There's what can I say? There's a diversity of opinions on this topic among journalists, and I think there have been states and the feds have come up with workable definitions. I don't think it's impossible to come up with a definition that would be supported ultimately by case law that would, that would be workable. And I personally would be, I think that's workable. I think it's doable. I don't have a huge problem with it. I also think there are enough journalists who do have a problem with it in terms of where it stands in relation to the First Amendment. And I also know that there are members of the public who are concerned about setting up a differential class of requesters. So I guess my mind is still not totally made up on this, but I do think we could spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out how to define this, when really I don't sense that any of the places that have done this that suddenly, they've offered fee waivers to a broad class of people. I don't have a sense that anybody has gone out and like that made up journalistic credentials have, come out of the woodwork as a result. I think it's like, we didn't hear that from the FOIA folks, and that's where the media special, front of the line treatment comes from. So I just don't. I just would hate to spend a huge amount of time over this issue. I hear what you're saying, Mark, but I also think it's kind of fringe. It's not. I mean, the Joe six packs, I just don't see them. And I also, honestly, I'm not certain. My broader point that I think ultimately I'll make is that I think it's really hard for us to judge worthy requesters, and that's really what the law currently is set up to do. You get access, like the potential for free access, which really means any access, if you can show that you are worthy. And I can think of no other public service where we make that a stipulation. I mean, means testing for government benefits, yes, but in terms of worthiness, do we determine, like, are you smart enough to cast a good vote? Are you entitled to have a free ballot, or do you have to pay for it? Or, worthiness for a public education. Are you likely to benefit from this education and give back through a cure for cancer? We don't set that as a test for whether you pay or how much you pay. So all these discussions about who is worthy and who's not worthy I find problematic.
Okay, thank you, Steve. A couple of members of the public want to weigh in on this. Brian Decker.
Hi, thanks. I'm a lawyer with Oregon Justice Resource Center, and focusing on transparency and accountability, which in my role with this nonprofit civil rights organization involves facilitating a lot of public records requests from my organization with the goal of public education, particularly around criminal justice issues. And I just wanted to put in a plug for consideration of nonprofits like my civil rights organization as a stakeholder in requesting public records for a public interest purpose that is kind of analogous to the media, but might not otherwise be included in some sort of media consideration for reduced cost. So just a suggestion for nonprofit organizations to also potentially have access to reduced costs in requesting records.
Thank you, Brian. Todd, correct me if I'm wrong, but the ability to argue for the public interest is open to anyone at this point in time, correct, in the law?
Yes, and so media tends to get the benefit of the doubt that they're working in the public interest, which is why I think there's such wrangling around defining it. But yeah, anyone can attempt to make that showing.
Thank you. Joe Barker, did you have a comment on this number 13?
It
appears not. Okay.
Emily, if I may respond to our previous speaker, I think in Todd's straw man, his concern has been addressed. So I just want to point that out to our previous questionnaire about his nonprofit. If I understood the straw man correctly, his organization would be considered in a similar bucket if I understood the draft correctly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Joe Barker, did you have a comment on this?
Yes, ma'am. From what I've gathered from the previous meeting, media generally defines their records request under the concept of public interest. Public interest, when you're talking a government, is pretty much everything, with the exception of, and even those could actually be classified as a public interest, nuclear transportation sites, transportation routes, when you're doing things like that. So to distinguish between media having reduced cost and your ARP senior groups having the same public interest but being charged a full request cost, I just think that if you just keep everybody on the same playing field, it would be equal, instead of trying to designate, as Scott, as Steve said, who's worthy to receive the reduced cost.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. Joe, excuse me. I see your A and I keep wanting to say Ann. Steve?
That's okay. Long story. I'll accept either.
Thanks. Steve, did you have your hand up again, or?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Joe. I do think it's true. It's like a lot of non-media requesters may be making a request in the public interest. Of course, under current statute and under the strawman proposal, there's still the ability to make a public interest case even if you're not a media requester. So, I mean, this is not creating exclusive classes. And I just wanted to make clear that I'm not staking out a position where I would never accept like a FOIA type treatment which does create a media, presumption of public interest for news media. I do think, and I will continue to argue that the public interest creating a public interest test is messy, and I would love to find a way in a different direction. But if we end up sticking with a public interest test, then I think I'd find it acceptable to leave news media as a presumption of public interest. Some of my colleagues may not agree, but I think there's a workable solution.
Thanks, Steve. I'm noting it's 5 till 3. I feel so close to the end of this document. I want to talk about what our next steps are. Todd, I did see your hand up. Is that something that, given the 5 minutes left, do you want to bring up whatever you're going to bring up, or?
Oh, I was just going to do my due diligence as vice chair and give you a time check.
Oh, look at that. We're on the same wavelength already. Yes. So yeah, it's 5 till we have, we have 4 more items listed. They were actually, 2 of them were added today in discussion and may actually relate back to other ones we talked about. I had hoped to get through all of this today. I have 2 proposals. One is that we extend our meeting time for 15 minutes and attempt to do that. I understand that may not be a good idea. The other is that we open the next meeting with this, but attempt to do it relatively quickly. And I can already take the step to look through the others and begin to transfer it into a more usable document to move on to solutions at the next meeting. So thoughts?
Madam Chair, I would like to try to conclude our meeting as close to on time as possible. I'm in the middle of a move, so that's fun. I also want to ensure that the public has an opportunity to comment before we conclude our meeting. So I would hope that we could continue this discussion. I agree or admit that these conversations perhaps are going a little bit longer than we anticipated, but I think this is important exercise for us to continue and complete with adequate time. So I would suggest we carry on to the next meeting and allow the public to comment at this time.
Thanks, Mark. Steve, go ahead.
I agree with that. A quick suggestion. I think 15 and 16 are things that we moved down from earlier discussion, so I think they're all things that we agree on. And 14 and 15 are things that I think we have discussed, and we haven't discussed them recently, but I think they've come up, and my sense is that there's support for them. Could we just do a quick kind of show of hands of like whether people can get behind 14 and 15 and call it done, or discover that there's more discussion needed?
For 14, I think for me, it is something that does warrant some discussion, because what we're talking about is, what we heard from that, especially from the person who wrote that book, about the number of people who can only get to public records requests because they can't get the information any other way, like lawyers, like people who are looking for at the federal level, their immigration files and things like that. It seems a little bit worth fleshing out to me to understand as a group together, that one in particular. Number 15 for me, seems like that's pretty, that is a real
So
concern.
Could we quickly just deal with 15, 16, 17 and all those done?
I can agree that all of those are pain points, and identify that I mean, the number 15, I would say, particularly would be an agency concern, like a most direct one, although they're very intertwined. And these would be all parties, I would suggest, as far as like who this affects most directly. So just a quick, anybody else have a comment on these? And then I will entertain a straw poll on whether we can just go ahead and accept those and have number 14 left to discuss. Okay, getting lots of thumbs up. Okay, so we're going to consider those all. So just I'm going to take that as an all in favor because of all the thumbs I saw. Just saying this out loud for the record, since that's our official record. And we'll start the next meeting looking at number 14, which will be our last one. We did entertain public comment at the appropriate times during the meeting as each piece came up. If there is someone who'd like to make an additional comment from the public right now, I'd welcome that. Joe Barker, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the last meeting, I offered to do some research, and Todd was gracious enough to place those two particular items as documents 6 and 7 at the underneath the June 24th meeting, and if anyone would like to review them. And thank you, Todd, for placing those there.
Great. And June 24th, remind me which, is that the full PRAC or the non-legislative subcommittee?
It was this committee.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. That's okay. Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Joanne. Thanks for attending today. I'm open for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Beforehand, Madam Chair, when our next meeting, I believe is already scheduled, correct? That would be 3 weeks from today, which would be August what, 5?
Correct. August 5th. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that we were all aware that we'll be planning on meeting again in 3 weeks. Thank you. And I would move to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Yeah, all in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thanks, you guys, all of you, for such good discussion today. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Aye.